and that is true. I think everybody should. But I actually figured out that it was something that I felt called to do. This is where my ministry was, with the suffering, with the ill, in critical spaces. I've been doing this since 2017. I followed it to seminary at Duke, and then was at the VA in Durham, and then for a fellowship in palliative care came here. As of last year, I was hired on at the VA part-time and was blessed to have a part-time appointment here at Travis Park as well. And I've been working in outpatient mental health as a chaplain. And one of the things that we do is we address moral injury. We do that with our veterans. And moral injury is a very specific kind of injury that is really prevalent in veterans, but not limited to those who've served in combat spaces or those who've had combat exposure. Moral injury, and I'll talk about this more later in the breakout session, so a little advertisement if you want to come see me later, about what moral injury exactly is, but suffice it to say we all are born into systems that give us a moral code. Many of us are born into systems that are in faith communities that give us a moral code. They tell us what is and isn't right. And we don't just learn that, we internalize it. It becomes a part of who we are. We no longer think about it, we just know. We see something and we're like, nope, I'm not doing that. And welcome, Abel. And we see something else and we're like, man, I really feel like that's right. I really do. I see something special there. Now, the problem with moral injury becomes you're in a situation where you can't say no and something bad happens. And a piece of you is torn apart. And you don't have a way to rectify it. You don't have a way to be active in that space because it could harm you, it could harm others, it could create a situation that's even worse. That's the essence of moral injury. Now, there's way more to it. And a lot of people confuse it with PTSD, or they think you need to have PTSD to have moral injury. That's not true. You can have both. You don't have to. You can have one or the other. What I want to talk about today is a specific idea that I have. Moral injury is still a developing field. This was really only discovered as a concern in the early 90s by Jonathan Shea, working with Vietnam veterans. It has since kind of moved out into the world. I finished my work, you can read it in the short bio, with the Shea Moral Injury Center last fall. And this came out of that community that included both active duty chaplains, it included other clergy, it included mental health professionals. There were about 50 of us that went through this training together as a cohort. And we spent time together, and it was also accredited by ILIF for those of you who care about accreditation and that kind of stuff. I was surprised. I was doing it because I needed to learn how to do my job better. And at the end of it, I said, you know, one of the characteristics for me that I feel is important about moral injury is that you're in a situation where there is an authority that you don't feel like you can say no to, or that controls some portion of what it is that you do and are. Where are we? We're in church. Who helps you learn your moral code? What happens when they tell you things that you feel maybe are wrong, as if they're law? You believe it. And you can be wounded. So this particular set of slides is about religious moral injury. So as Bob mentioned, one of the things we do in restoration and reconciliation is confession and taking responsibility. We are accountable. We are implicated in the wounds of some of the people in our congregations. So this concept of moral injury is not in the books. It's not something we talk about when we talk about treating moral injury, but I believe it's real, and I've seen it, and I believe that we need to do something about it. And it starts with understanding that it exists and that we are a part of it, have been a part of it, and need to be a part of the solution. But today is confession. Next slide. So the outline of this presentation, because it was kind of in an academic setting, and keep in mind all this was done before General Conference with no idea of what was going to happen there. But first we'll talk about the abstract purpose, population, and process. And then I want to talk a little bit about trauma responses in religious moral injury. So there are trauma responses. I want people to hear that. That does not mean that we immediately go to PTSD, but I just want to outline those things because they're important to how we think about sort of the healing. Growth processes in religious moral injury, and then conditions for sites of healing, because you can't just go to any church and expect to be healed. You can't go to any community and expect to be healed. You can't go just anywhere. And then I'll talk a little bit about the things I'm working on, hopefully, that will eventually lead to some healing. And this is not a quick or easy process, and I'm in conversation. Thank you. Next slide, please. These are really small for this. I will read it to you. The abstract is that religious institutions have caused moral injury by characterizing identity, a person's identity, who you are, as a sin, and thereby devaluing personhood from the position of a perceived legitimate authority. That's a really key word there. Vilifying a person based on their identity and or core beliefs damages their self-image as a good person. So this is the trick with religious communities, that when we say to someone, no, your identity is sinful, we actually have a position of authority where they will start to believe it. And it will damage their self-image. It will damage who they are. It will damage their belief about themselves. Their own sense of being a beloved child of God, which is true today, tomorrow, every day, and was true every day until they heard it, is damaged by a religious authority saying, no, this is sinful. And we just heard, are you loved? Yes. Will you always be loved? Yes. When someone tells you otherwise, they speak out of power, not love. You can be left with feelings of guilt and shame imposed by a religious authority perceived to be valid in making those assessments. Affected populations include, but are not limited to, LGBTQ+ people of faith, or people who are not of any faith, individuals losing their church homes due to disaffiliation, and we know that story, or the poor and unhoused in the context of prosperity gospel theology. Moral injury needs to be addressed with those affected through education, institutional acknowledgement, we talk about it here, and group processing of the injury. One of the methods we use is acceptance and forgiveness therapy, which is a group therapy that we engage at the VA. I'm trying to adapt that for institutional settings like the church. But it is important that it is in a group. Unique to this injury is the need to offer reconciliation processes with the individual's faith identity in a manner of their choosing. Okay, we don't impose this on people. If someone has religious moral injury, you go to them and you say, I think I see this. What happened? Is there a path to reconciliation? Some people might say no. And we have to be okay with that. What we can offer them is a path to self-forgiveness In other words, a restoration of their own idea that they are loved by God. And the rest is at their choosing. We can say, God loves you. Can we all say that? Can we say that to people? Yes. Thank God. Next slide, please. This gets a little wonky, a little bit into the weeds, but yes, trauma responses to religious moral injury. Next slide. So, who knows the 4 responses to trauma? Anybody? Yes. People are so uncomfortable with fawn, they leave it off. They don't talk about it. and it disproportionately affects women, and I am furious that people don't talk about it. But I'll get there. Freeze. These are specifically framed in terms of faith community. So you have a trauma response from being judged this way, being told that your personhood is a sin or that you are not valid because of what someone believes about you, which is counter to knowing that God loves everyone as they are, as a beloved child of God. Freeze is isolation, including loss of connection to faith and faith community. So that's shame. I won't go there anymore. I'm not good enough. Flight, loss of faith in religion as an institution. So as an institution, right? They may still have a relationship to God on their own. They may still believe that they're okay. But I'm going to run away because you people are harmful. I touched that fire, and that fire burned me. I'm angry. I don't want to see you anymore. I'm out of here. That's fight. Sorry. Flight is avoidance of religion and even religious people to the point of seeing them as evil. So in other words, you say, those Christians, they hate us. They're evil. And they've got a point. We need to be more open. Always this has been the conversation. And fawn, there are people who are told your personhood's not valid. You are not supposed to be in the church, but you know what? We'll love you through it. We'll fix you. And those people believe it. They take that authority from those who tell them that, and they say, I'm going to lean into this God thing. I'm going to lean into it so hard. I'm going to be everywhere. I'm going to do all the things. I'm going to volunteer everywhere. I'm going to sing the loudest. I hope that, yes, I can be fixed when they don't need to be fixed. Next slide, please. So this kind of lays out what I've already been talking about. Religious moral injury. There is an underlying desire or belief transgressed. I think a good statement of that is, I want to be loved by the divine, and church should be a place where I will be loved and nurtured. There is an unconditional love of the divine. I feel like it. That's what's transgressed. That's the core value that people transgress when they cause religious moral injury, when they say, no, this is conditional. This is a place where you'll be loved here if, right? That's how you transgress that. Treatment response. So, in other words, how do we work against this? We affirm that the grace of the divine is not contingent. There is no if I am good. Instead, I am good because of the divine in me recognized by others, which is a core of the group process. This is why I keep saying we need to do this as a group. Now, there's no greater group than the body of Christ. This church, this body, anybody that can affirm people for who they are and that grace is unconditional can do this work. Further consideration, some of this may cross into questions of eschatology and theodicy, in other words, salvation and suffering in religious settings. Those are important things to have answers for when you approach these topics because they're hard questions. I've had them. And it requires discussion with the religious community before self-identifying as a site of healing and reconciliation. So in other words, you have to have an explicit conversation about how you're going to talk to people who have been injured before you engage this work. This is not something you pick up and say, I want to address this, because you're going to hurt people. You're going to hurt people in the process of trying to help them. I will say, Travis Park has had this conversation. I would still want to be very intentional in this space about how we did any repair work. So even when you've had the conversation, it better be explicit, and it better have qualified people, and it better have good conversation partners and leaders and people who are committed. Because this is how people see themselves in relation to God. This isn't a question that is outside of them. This is inside. This is who you are. That's dangerous territory. You need to be very, very careful. Next slide, please. Oh, Henry Nouwen, one of my favorites. If you haven't read Adam the Beloved, I recommend you do it. This is from a different book, Turn My Mourning into Dancing. Hope is willing to leave unanswered questions unanswered and unknown futures unknown. Hope makes you see God's guiding hand not only in the gentle and pleasant moments, but also in the shadows of disappointment and darkness. Can you do it? Can you see the hope in the darkness? I hope so. This is the work. Someone is hurt. Someone has said, no more church. I'm not doing it. I believe in God, but I will not be there. They have hurt me. Or, I believe so much, and I just want this to be taken away. I want to be different. Neither of those things need to be true. Next slide, please. Growth process. This is talking about how we do this. And keep in mind, too, this is my work, and I will take correction. I will take advice. I will take anything you have to offer, because as a group, we are greater than anything that I can do alone. Recognition. We help people recognize where the hurt is. I was hurt by my religious leader, institution, or community. Can we help them recognize where the pain is so that they can know the shape? You have to know the shape. You have to know the tenor. You have to know the story to be able to address it. Let them express how they feel about it. This can be that they were left feeling unworthy, shameful, guilty, or angry. Those 4 trauma responses. It could be anything else, too. But there usually is a precipitating event that has a character. Then we help them reclaim agency. I cannot control the actions or perceptions of others. We help them be whole in themselves. We remind them that their relationship can exist inside or outside of a community. And the community I choose should honor who I am, because I am worthy, because I am loved by God. No conditions. This growth process, this recovery, can stop right there, and we have not involved a church one bit. This is what I meant when I said we can help them get back to wholeness, and they can say no more church, and that can be it. And we have to be okay with that, because maybe the injury is so deep that we don't have a place to invite them into. Now, the hope is that once they get closer to wholeness, maybe they will find their way home. But we can't drag them there. There's no healing in dragging someone into a place. So, what we hope for, the hope in the darkness is communion. An affirming community can observe, validate, grieve, and accompany the wounded person in their recovery. Through communal lament, worship and praise, they can rediscover or discover anew a faith or spiritual life that enhances their relationship to the divine. The movement from fear to faith. I love the story of Jacob at the Jabbok because there is so much fear in Jacob. Really, all the way up till the wrestling, right? And then once he's in it, he's like, what do I do? I'm wrestling. I'm stuck. I'm stuck. And Jacob doesn't get out of it unscathed. Jacob walks with limp. But Jacob understands something new and different about God after wrestling. That's a hope. In the best case scenario, they may discover a deeper zeal for the divine as a result of their struggle. I just like the image of David dancing, mostly because he's shamed for it later. And when you have zeal, you don't care who's watching, right? At that point, you're who you are. You're unapologetic. And you will live this life. And you will be a witness. How powerful to have turned your struggle into dancing, right? Next slide. Restorative action of religious institutions. You need to be an affirming community that honors personhood, provides acceptance, and centers your witness in grace as an unearned gift from the divine. Keep coming back to this unconditionality of God's love. That's theologically important for me. I hope it's theologically important for you. If it's not, I hope that grace will work with you and in you. And we need supportive presence, which goes beyond a traditional offering of worship to engage with individuals in their struggle. It's easy to have a church that does Sunday, and sometimes with the smaller churches, we feel that's all we can do. It's hard enough to get 20 people here on Sunday. How do I do anything else? But this goes beyond that. You can't do this on a Sunday. And you realize that God's work is not only in the preaching and the teaching, but the doing and the caring for all people. Which we do. We just don't always do it great. And that's the other side of grace. We don't always have to do it great, as long as we try. Next slide, please. This is kind of more for the group that I presented to initially, but since MI comes out of military context, really for the research, there are pieces of military culture that really lend themselves to moral injury. It's an institution. It's formative of identity. It's not continuous throughout your life. It's possible to complete and allows a person to gain distance from the institution if necessary. These are differences between the military and church. Church holds greater authority in the life of a believer. It's formative of identity and is perceived as legitimate authority on core values. Formation is lifelong. Lifelong. You're never done. At least I'm never done. I can't speak for you, I guess. I assume too much. If a person is a believer, they grow closer to their faith as they age unto death. That I have seen. Having worked in palliative care, I see it. People who come in who are agnostic, and a week later, they are as Christian as you can get. It is a miracle. But in some ways, this idea of religious moral injury carries more weight with people because you carry your religion with you all the time. You carry your faith with you all the time. Military service doesn't go away from you, but you retire. You get some space. You don't retire from God, right? And you don't retire from the institutions that are formative for you. So in some ways, we hold a greater responsibility to know about this and to be aware of it and not to respond to it in a sort of knee-jerk way, but to be really, really intentional about it. Next slide, please. This I offer with all humility. This is my work. I have started working on a program, and this is where I need to say I'm not here as a representative of the VA, but since it's part of my work, I mentioned some of the work that I do. I have convened, at this point, a professional committee, which is myself and a psychologist and other chaplains working in this space. We do have an LCSW. I have not talked to psychiatry, but they mostly write scripts, and that's not really relevant here. Moral injury is not a diagnosis. It does not have medication. The IDT curriculum is in planning. We have actually at this point decided that we're not going to do a 4-week moral injury psychoeducation curriculum. I guess I should say something about this. We do education with individuals about what moral injury is prior to inviting them to a therapeutic or a group that will help them address their moral injury. If you don't know what it is, to join a therapeutic group that is very, very deep and very, very personal can be problematic because you need to be fully committed to the idea before you get in. We already have a 4-week psychoeducation curriculum, so we don't have to develop a new one around this. It is, as long as you broaden the definition, you can use the same curriculum. Dr. Pernicano is retiring. She has done amazing work in this field. I've been just blessed to work with her. She is also a very interesting person to work with. I find her occasionally saying more spiritual things than I do in the space, even though she's a psychologist. And her and I have had a lot of conversations about grace and forgiveness. That she is a lovely person, and I cherish her work and her input. Very faithful woman. Engage church stakeholders to plan and implement restorative action. Hello. Here we are. So this is another piece that you are now a part of. We're looking for affirming communities, grace-based, non-punitive theologies, commitment to restorative action, not just rhetoric, in other words, really doing it, and then maybe, and I'm talking months to years, program deployment. Is there a way to do this? Can we do it responsibly? Can we invite people in? Yeah. You ever have that feeling where you like invite work and then it's like all of a sudden heavier? Next slide, please. Summary. Moral injury began as a response to struggles born out of combat. As our understanding of the impact of moral injury broadens, it's natural that the perceived moral arbiters, any religious community, institution, would themselves be implicated in its wounds as well as its treatment. Any questions? I think next slide's the last slide. Yeah, and you got my VA contact there, but I also have Travis Park contact. I tried to add that in, but I had technical difficulties 2 days ago. I couldn't put it on there. It wouldn't let me change anything. Any questions? Any thoughts? Any feedback? Yes, ma'am.
This is fascinating, and I find it personally fascinating too, because my husband is a retired Marine.
Mm-hmm.
Has really had moral injury things, and he and I have had discussions very similar to this, making ties, but I've never had the language for it. So I'm so excited right now, seeing all of this and the work that can be done. A question that I have right now, I feel like a lot of us think we're on the other side, and
So the question is around how do we deal with moral injury, which is still occurring, right? In this conference, I'll broaden it. Any conference. I mean, we do have it here, but it's any conference. Whether it's a progressive conference or not, there's still moral injury happening. And how is it different now that we've had General Conference? Short answer, it isn't. There's injury, there's injury. You build a hospital. The difference isn't that nobody gets hurt anymore. It's that now you got a place to go. Doesn't stop people getting hurt. And there's so much in it. The poor will be with you always. You recognize those words? We're never going to quite figure out how to do this relationship thing perfectly. We will always have wounds we inflict upon each other. I'd like us to do it better. I'd like us to have more resources. This is more. But I want to go back to sort of what you asked, which is like the before and after. I kind of name that as a false dichotomy, right? There is no before and after. There is what was, there is what is, and there's all the people who have lives that were lived up to that point that continue to live lives that don't know anything about this change. The injury's still real, right? So, and having a change doesn't make an injury go away, right? Changes in the discipline are not a Band-Aid for wounds which have happened, unless you tear the pages out of the discipline and staunch the blood with it, right? But that's a powerful image, but there aren't enough pages. Yes, George.
I'm retired Navy. I'm a Vietnam veteran. I was not combat, but I sure did get property. One of my seminary teachers in systematic theology was a card carrier out in prison jail for veterans of the Vietnam War. We were having a discussion about what was the responsibility of the Christian who's part of a corporation. Thank you. Who's part of a corporation to influence that corporation to honor the social contract that they may or may not acknowledge. And that discussion was following a class where the question was posed. So it devolved into taste great, less filling, taste great, corporations are great, corporations are evil. So I asked Professor Cherry, who went to Duke? Who went to Duke? You did. Did you? Oh, no, she wasn't there. She was at Princeton. But she was at Perkins when I was there. And I said to her, Dr. Cherry, would you have spit on me when I came home? Now, she knew what I was doing because I was old dirt when I started seminary. And what we talked about was how we had come towards each other in the intervening 20 years. A second, and this is just a quick support. When I went through the Academy for Spiritual Formation about 15 years ago, Roberta Matthews Green was one of our presenters. She was the mother of the American Orthodox Church in Baltimore. And she described a reconciliation procedure that their congregation underwent every year at the beginning of Lent. And they would all line up facing each other in the congregation, and they'd make a metania, which is a great big sign of the cross like this. And then in front of the person, before God and before you in this last year, I have sinned in these ways. List. Will you forgive me? Yes or no? Then each of you move one to the left. And you You do that until you've met everybody in the congregation, including the pastor, to offer your vulnerability and to receive forgiveness from that person, not the whole congregation. By the time she had finished describing that, I was weeping because I knew there was not a Protestant church in this country that can do that, because people don't trust one another enough in order to do the healing that is necessary. And Tim, I'm so glad that you've brought all this stuff, because you've offered us a pathway to begin the process of the basic theology of the church that leads to the healing and the restoration of everybody that comes in the door. If they will receive it, if they trust us enough. We have to show ourselves to be trustworthy. My undergraduate degree is in history, and I really focused on that when I was in seminary, and I'm going to say just flat out, the church has a lot to apologize for. And it's millennia long. Let's start with 325 AD, and then we can go from there. Thanks.
Thank you, George.
So I do have a question, but
Yes, Darryl.
if you'd humor me for a second, while I have a voice, since I'm part of the LGBTQ plus group, that the discussion is back in regards to moral injury, and you know, Pastor Tim, how much I love you,
Yes.
and I agree with all of this, and it's something much needed. But there is need for understanding, and one size doesn't fit all. So, as you said, we have to be careful how we approach this, because not everyone in the LGBTQ plus community is morally injured. I shared a journey with you. I mean, my church, you know, I'm not sure the early Christians that met in secret in community were part of a mainstream religion necessarily, but that was provided to me by a mother. And it was also provided to me by this beautiful reverend right here for decades. So that needs to be understood, because we don't want to injure someone else more by telling them they're injured,
Yeah.
if they're not. And I'm not angry about that. I'm just wanting a discussion about that. And I guess my question to you is, how do we be sensitive about that? How do you roll this out without making, because when I saw that in the agenda, I will have to admit, it made me a little, hopefully didn't get to the point of anger. But I'm like, so you're going to tell me that I'm injured and ask forgiveness for it, you know? The church is going to ask forgiveness for it. And I know that's not what you're saying, but I'm just curious to know how that would be rolled out.
I think that's a really valid point. And I thank you for bringing that forward, because, you know, there are things that I assume in the process here, and I appreciate the feedback, because that's something that I should say at the beginning, which is not everyone is injured because of their identity. This isn't causal, right? Like, not everyone suffers just because of who they are. But the idea is that you could have, and people have suffered because of their identity, but I wouldn't assume it, okay? So in the rolling out, so this is more about assessment. So when we talk about moral injury, there is an assessment. We don't ever bring someone in and say, you're injured, and just say it. Right? That's inappropriate. We wouldn't. You don't walk up to someone who's smoking and say, you have cancer, right? You gotta figure that out. Like, there's diagnostics. I see you. I'll get to you in just 1 minute. Yeah. The assessment portion has to do with those feelings of guilt and shame and being stuck in that. Okay, when we talk about moral injury, it's not, you can have morally injurious events. That doesn't mean you end up with moral injury, because it's about being stuck. If you're stuck in it, if you can't get out of it, you can't see your way out of it, you begin to have deep feelings of a lack of self-worth, you begin to isolate, you begin to say, people will be better off without me, I don't have a place, I don't belong, I am not good enough, no one, including God, loves me. That's what you assess for. You look for that pain. And you say, can you ever get out of that? Do you see a path? No, I don't. This is just who I am. You have moral injury, right? And you help someone begin to move back towards that living, back towards that sense. It doesn't mean, and it can happen from any number of things. You don't have to be LGBTQ+. Like many of the people I see, they're combat veterans. Their moral injury is about what happened to them, what they saw, what they didn't do, who they were betrayed by. These are all pieces that can cause moral injury. This particular presentation is aimed at a very specific setting and application of moral injury. So this is not global, right? And there would be an assessment. And I would never say to someone, because you're part of the LGBTQIA+ community, you have moral injury. That's not the deal. But has the church caused it for people who have marginalized identities? Absolutely, yeah.
I'm Diana, and what you've talked about really speaks to a lot of different participants and recipients within the context of the church in receiving moral injury, and it's really spoken to me today. I grew up in a family filled with alcoholism with both parents, and I say God protected me first with the Southern Baptists. And I was brought into the Southern Baptist Church early in my formative years, and God bless the church ladies that took me to church and took me to Sunday school and Bible study and youth group. And so I went in as a teenager to living in foster care with the family of the church, and going through college, this group in this church supported me, and the pastor supported me in going to college. In college, I became a home missionary as a student, and this is an experience that that in recent days and in this time of reconciliation has really troubled my heart, because as a group of young students, we worked in a youth prison in Columbia, South Carolina, and we were all working on different campuses, and amongst our group there was a African-American young man that during the time that we were there, he was consoling a young man, because we were working on the campus of young men, 15 to 17-year-olds. And he was comforting a young man who was gay, and he had confided that he also was gay, and our chaplain found out about it. And so I was 19 at the time, so by that time, my life had come together. You were speaking about the moral code of becoming your internalized place, and he brought the young man in with all of us, and just him and all, we're 19-year-olds, and he asked the young man to leave the ministry, and he asked him to leave, and he asked not to be released from his assignment. And the authority who was involved in this setting went around and asked every individual one of us as 19-year-olds what we thought, and what, should we accept or should he be released. And so anyway, one by one, and I still remember his name, Kevin. Everybody said no, and when they got to me, he looked at me, and something in him, he said, "Diana, I really think that, you're different about this. But I didn't answer, but I looked away from him, and I put my head down, and I said nothing." And in these situations of reconciliation, it is important for us as a church to confess, no matter how bad or indifferent or walking away or looking away, that we've participated. In my life since that time and in this place, I have stood up, but I did not stand up that day, and I did not do anything that day. And I personally created a moral injury that day. And I feel the injury as well. So anyway, I think that this is very necessary.
Well, that was going to be my question. Who's the moral injury? Who bears it? You do.
I do, and I believe wherever he is.
Well, if you don't mind, this is a beautiful example of Diane confessing, right, and understanding that she was in a situation where there was a greater authority that you were addressed by, and you were asked to say something that you really didn't believe, that you didn't feel was right. And that you, even if you had said yes, it was not you who caused the injury, and it was not you who were responsible. You were being asked, and in some ways told, "I need you to say this," by someone who had authority over you. And so you bear that injury. The injury is yours, and you didn't injure the other person. Thank you for sharing that. Thank you. How are we doing on time? Yeah. Okay. All right. I see other questions. I'm sorry. You can grab me in a break. Thank you for the feedback. Thank you very much, Daryl. I will add that actually to the slides, because that's a really important point, that I had an assumption, right? And I didn't state it explicitly, and I needed to. I thank you for participating. Thank you for being here. Everything we do is a seed. You now have more information. Cautionary tale, you don't have all the information. But be aware, when you hear this term moral injury, there is a lot more to it. And I'll be doing a breakout session to teach you a little more about moral injury versus PTSD, how they interact, how they're different, how they can exist independently. And in that session, you can ask more generally about moral injury, which is where I would have done better to have more information so that Daryl would have understood more clearly where I was going. So, but thank you. You're the best, as always. Yes. Thank you all.